Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Welcome, Mr. Cameron. Welcome to you, Mr. Cameron, and we'll go straight to our first question, and it is from Robert Newman.
Mr. Cameron, you and the Remain camp seem to be convinced that if Britain leaves the EU, that we will be plunged into recession. 6 months ago, you told the CBI that Britain could survive outside the EU. Why are you now so adamant that we'll be plunged into economic meltdown if we decide to leave?
Well, we can certainly survive outside the EU. I think the question for us is, how do we thrive? How do we do best? How do we create opportunities and jobs and chances for our children and our grandchildren? That, to me, is what this debate is about. And I think what's so unique about it is the extraordinary consensus. 9 out of 10 economists, the Governor of the Bank of England, the International Monetary Fund, all saying that they believe we would suffer a hit to our economy, a hit to jobs. And what that means for people is lower living standards, potentially lower wages, higher prices in our shops, and yes, potentially a recession. And I think it would be irresponsible for me, as your Prime Minister, not to warn of these things. After all, the IMF, the OECD, some of these bodies are actually paid to warn Prime Ministers when their economies face risks. So yes, we could find a way, but in my view, it's not the right way. And I want to, if I can, just take a moment to say why all these experts, I believe, are right. And it's to do with this single market. 500 million people. It's where we sell half of the goods and services that we export, almost half. And of course, if we have less good access to that market, our economy will be smaller. There will be fewer opportunities. That's why I think the experts are right. I think we should listen to their opinions, and I think we should vote to remain on June the 23rd.
Robert, would you like to come back on that?
You refer to, we have a Treasury which didn't forecast a credit crunch. We have a Home Office which predicted that only 16,000 people would come over from Eastern Europe. The last time anybody counted, 1.6 million had already arrived.
I accept forecasters don't always get it right, but I can't remember a time when you've had such a consensus of all these bodies and all these economists. And as I say, what they're saying makes common sense to me, because if you're a great trading nation, and we are a great trading nation, and if you cut yourself off from your most important market and have worse terms in that market, then you're going to be disadvantaged. Now, what Nigel Farage said was that multinational companies or others wouldn't reduce their investments in Britain. But let's take, for instance, the car industry, a fantastic success in our country, 150,000 people employed in it, another 300,000 helping to supply it. If we had the same situation as America, which was what Mr. Farage was talking about, our cars would face a 10% tariff, a 10% tax. And that's why I think you'd see less investment and less jobs. So I think there's a real consensus now that we'd be worse off if we were to leave.
Mr. Cameron, thank you. Forgive me for moving on. We've got lots to get through.
Sure.
We're going to take a question now from Anthony Gould.
Prime Minister, you gave an excellent speech in 2013 outlining the minimum reforms that you wanted to get from the EU. One of the key ones from my perspective, running a small business, was that you wanted to remove the free movement of people so that we could recruit skilled people from all over the world, not baristas from the EU. You were basically humiliated on that. So why on earth are you now saying that the EU is wonderful? You were saying then you'd leave if you didn't get those reforms.
What I said in the reforms that I sought, I said we need it to be less of a single currency club, so I wanted guarantees for the pound, our currency, and I got those. I said I wanted it to be less bureaucratic, so I wanted targets to cut regulation, including on small businesses, and I got that. I said that I wanted to make sure it was less of a political union for us. I think we're there for trade and cooperation and working together, but we want to live in a country called Great Britain and be part of a European Union. And so I've got us out of ever closer union. And crucially, on migration and the movement of people, I said I didn't think it was right that people could come to our country and immediately take out of the benefit system, including the in-work benefit system. And what I've secured is this idea, this proposal, that if people come here, first of all, they can't claim unemployment benefit. If they don't have a job within 6 months, they have to go home. And if they do work here, and many people do work here and make a great contribution, but if they do work here, they don't get full access to our welfare system until they've worked here for 4 years.
Now,
I think that is a real advance for us because it's no more something for nothing. It's saying, yes, come here and work, come here and contribute, but you have to pay in before you get out.
Mr Gould, would you like to come back on that?
Yes, but if you need skilled people from outside the EU, it's devilish difficult. I've even had to spend thousands of pounds, wait over a year to get a Tier 2 visa for my staff to come here. It's ridiculous when somebody can walk in here and do the most junior, unskilled job from the EU. We can't get the skilled people we need from anywhere where we need them.
Well, obviously, the control of immigration, I'm sure we'll talk about it tonight, is an important issue. It's an important challenge. And one of the ways we try and control it from the rest of the world is we say that we should do more to train our own people here to do the jobs that the British economy is delivering.
Okay.
And so what we have is if there's a shortage of a particular occupation, we say to business, OK, you can go and seek that from overseas. But what I want to see is more apprenticeships, more people going to university, more young people trained to do the jobs that our economy is creating. And that actually is probably the best way of reducing immigration and making sure there are jobs and livelihoods for our people.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Cameron. We're going to stay indeed with that issue of immigration now. We have a question for you from Harry Bapari.
Hi, Harry.
I have no GP as all are full in my area. I can't get onto the housing ladder and have 3 kids in one room. The place where I grew up was a lovely area, but is now a no-go zone. How is the EU and uncontrolled immigration working for me, a 40-year-old Brit who has been working full-time since the age of 16?
Well, what I'd say is I think there are good ways of controlling immigration, and I think there are bad ways of controlling immigration. A good way is what I just explained, of saying that people can come here, they can work, they can contribute, but they have to pay in before they get out. And when it comes to immigration from outside the EU, which of course is more than half, we do put a limit on the numbers that come for economic reasons. But I would say, really frankly, that I think if we want to build houses, if we want to invest in our health service, if we want good schools for our children, we've got to strengthen and safeguard our economy. And pulling out of the single market, which is what the Leave campaign want to do, that would damage our economy. Nigel Farage said it. He said, he kept on talking about GDP isn't all that matters. GDP is the size of our economy. It's the combination of all the wealth that our country creates. He's basically saying it doesn't really matter. He's so keen to get us out of Europe that he's prepared to sacrifice jobs and growth on the way. We mustn't do that. That's not the way to build houses or provide the health service we need.
Sorry, Mr. Cameron, I voted for you in the last election because one of the things on your manifesto was to get immigration down. You haven't been able to do that because you're not allowed to do that. That's the bottom line. So how are you, I can see my standard of living and my family's standard of living going down because of this influx that we can't control. Now, I'm sorry to say, but your closing statement last week was that if we leave the EU, we're rolling a dice with our children's future. I think quite the opposite. By you telling us to stay in, you've rolled that dice already.
Well, obviously, Obviously, I don't agree with that. I think the biggest risk we can take is to pull out of the EU, pull out of the single market, damage our businesses, damage jobs, and there'll be fewer opportunities for our children and grandchildren. And I say again, I hope that when people go to vote on June the 23rd, they think about their children and grandchildren. They think about the jobs and the opportunities they want for them, the sort of country that we want to build together, and they vote to say, we don't want little England of Nigel Farage. We want to be Great Britain, and we're great if we stay in these organisations and fight for the sort of values we believe in.
We want to stay on this issue of pressure on services and immigration. Mr Cameron, we have a question to you on the NHS from Sinead Dennis.
Mr Cameron, I don't have to tell you that the NHS is under immense pressure. We currently do not have enough resources for the demand from the service users. If we remain in the EU, what plans do you have to deal with the pressures of migrants on the NHS and its workers?
Well, first of all, I think if we stay in the EU and we keep our economy strong, that's the absolute key to providing a strong NHS. And that's why the head of the National Health Service, Simon Stevens, said it's only with a strong economy that you can keep putting money and resources into the NHS. On this issue of migration, I absolutely agree. It is a challenge, but I don't think it's a challenge we should meet by damaging our economy. And as we think about it, I think we should also think about the 50,000 EU nationals that work in our NHS. Very often you'll find the
We
people...
don't need EU nationals to work in the NHS. We've got enough skilled people in the NHS. If that was your main concern, you wouldn't be taking away the funding for the nurses, for students to go and study nursing. My issue is, what plans are we going to have in place so that people can get MRI scans when they need to, so that I don't have to let down people on a day-to-day basis. We're really under-resourced. So as much as it's nice that they can bring over doctors and nurses, what resources, what facilities can you put in place to ensure that we can deal with this high demand?
Well, what we're going to put in is an extra 12 billion in this Parliament into the NHS. But I would just make
12 billion towards what? We keep on hearing
12
it,
billion
like,
towards making sure that we meet waiting times, not just for cancer, but also for mental health. Making sure we've got...
Cancer. I just want to say, me and my co-workers, we're doing our part. We're providing excellent patient care.
Thank you.
You need to do your part and provide us with the right resources.
No,
Thank you. Let's leave it there. Mr. Cameron, we're going to leave it there, please, so I want to get another question in. And we've got a question now for you from Stuart John Channon.
Mr. Cameron, you went to the EU to reform our membership and get a better deal. Do you share my frustration that EU citizens are still able to come into the UK and claim benefits? And what assurances can you give us that if we stay, you will look for further reform?
Well, first of all, I agree with you. Reform doesn't end on June the 23rd if we vote to stay in. We should keep reforming this organisation. But I would say, and I think it's really important, I think we do have a special status in the EU already. We're not in the euro. We've got our own currency. We're not in the no-border zone. We've kept our own borders. We're now going to be out of the ever-closer union proposal. So our membership is right for Britain. It gives us the trade. It gives us the cooperation. It helps us work with other countries to get what we want. Now, in terms of reform, I think the things I secured do really help us. They safeguard our currency. It means we can't be discriminated against. They make sure that there are targets for cutting the regulations on business that people can find frustrating. And so, yes, the reform goes on. But, of course, if we leave, the reform ends. And here's what really happens if we leave. Of course, we'd still want to sell into that single market. So we'd still have to meet all the rules and the regulations that Brussels lays down, but we won't be at the table. We'll be like a country with our ear and our face pressed up against the glass, trying to find out what's happening with the other 27 countries, making rules that affect our country. And I would say that is no way for the fifth biggest country, biggest economy in the world to behave. We need to be in this organisation, fighting for British interests and for British jobs. Leaving is quitting. And I don't think we're quitters. I think we're fighters. We fight in these organisations for what we think is right.
Surely when you went for that deal, that was the opportunity to say, I've got this referendum coming. This is my opportunity to get the deal that will be right for Britain. But you weren't able to achieve that. Well, I don't see how we're going to be able to achieve that later on down the line.
Well, sir, you mentioned specifically the issue of benefits. And one of my key demands, which I got, was to say, if you come here, you don't get unemployment benefit. If you haven't got a job after 6 months, you have to leave. It is the free movement to come and work, but it's not the free movement to come and live off someone else's taxpayers. And uniquely in Britain, you're going to have to work here for 4 years, paying into the system, contributing to our economy, before you get full access to our welfare system. Okay. I think that is a really good proposal, and one, of course, that we only get if we stay. If we leave, reform is over, and I worry for what would happen to our economy and the jobs and the livelihoods of people, which I think is the most important thing in this referendum.
Thank you very much indeed. And just on a point of information on that, by how many figures do you expect the migration from the EU to fall as a result of the reform that you secured?
I haven't made a forecast because, frankly, we've had pretty extraordinary years recently in the European Union. In the first 5 years I was Prime Minister, our economy created more jobs than the rest of the European Union put together. And so we have seen a lot of people coming to live and coming to work here. Actually, 9 out of 10 people in work are British nationals. 2/3 of the jobs created since I've been Prime Minister have been British people taking those jobs. So I'm not going to make a forecast, but I think it stands to sense. If today you can come in from the EU and get £10,000 of tax credits on top of your wages, and I'm saying you're not going to have that in future, clearly that will make a difference.
OK, thank you very much indeed, Mr Cameron, for taking that point. And we get a question now on sovereignty from James Esses.
Mr Cameron, we recently celebrated the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta. The United Kingdom has been built on the pillars of democracy, and we have the greatest legal system in the world. Is it not shameful that since joining the EU, our Parliament is no longer sovereign, our Supreme Court is no longer supreme, and our nation is no longer self-governing?
Well, so what I would say... First of all, I think we're engaged in the greatest act of national sovereignty that we've had for many years, a referendum where not the politicians, but the people will decide whether we stay in this organisation or whether we leave. And I would say, having been your Prime Minister for the last 6 years, you know, Parliament is sovereign. We've just had a Queen's speech with a whole set of proposals and measures, some of which you might agree with and some of which you might disagree with, but they're British proposals for the British people from a British government. Now, you hear a lot of talk about patriotism in this referendum. As far as I'm concerned, I love this country with a passion. I think we're an amazing country. And I say if you love your country, then you don't damage its economy. You don't restrict opportunities for young people. You don't actually isolate your country and reduce its influence in the world. And frankly, I do worry about a second Scottish referendum if we vote to leave, and you don't strengthen your country by leading to its breakup. So I'm deeply patriotic. I think this is a case for a bigger, greater Britain inside a European Union. And let me go directly to this point about... Sorry, please do.
Your own House of Commons library has estimated that up to 55% of our laws are made by Europe, i.e. unelected bureaucrats, and we also are in the position that our own Supreme Court judges can be overruled by European judges, some of whom may never have even stepped foot in this country. It's a disgrace.
What I would say is, to me, what really matters, true sovereignty, is about control. Do you have control over your country's destiny? We're a trading nation. We need access to the single market. If we leave, it still exists, the EU still exists, we have to sell into that market. We'd have to obey every single one of the rules and regulations to sell into that market, but we'd have no say over what they are. Let's take the car industry again. I want to make sure we're around that table writing the rules for electric cars. I want us to be the leader. I want us to be the winners in Europe and in the world when it comes to technologies like this. And we don't enhance our influence by walking away or quitting. We reduce our influence. So it might give you the illusion of sovereignty to withdraw on June the 23rd, but you'd find out in area after area after area, things that affect our great country, we would have no say over. When we want to try and make sure Iran can't get a nuclear weapon, when we want to be strong in front of Putin's aggression in the Ukraine, we need to work in these organisations. We need to work in NATO. We need to work in the UN. And yes, we need to work in the EU. Sometimes it can drive me mad, right? It is a bureaucracy. It is frustrating. But I honestly believe walking away, quitting, would reduce our national influence, would reduce our economy, would reduce our say in the world, and as a result would damage our country.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Cameron. Thank you also to James for your question. And we have a question now also on similar issues from Joseph Cook.
Mr. Cameron, I know that we're all meant to elect our local MEP, but every time I ask my customers coming into my shop, who is your MEP, not one of them has got a clue. None. Now, that is shameful on our part, and it's shameful that the EU isn't reaching out where it should be. We just don't know who they are. We've got not a clue. And that is, I've been asked, especially with the referendum coming up, I've asked many of them, so many of them, and not one knows. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't want the European Parliament or the European Union to have more power. I want the power to reside in our Parliament. And if this is an important point, I think, for people who are concerned about the future, if there's any proposal to pass further powers from our Parliament to Brussels, automatically there has to be a referendum. So there's a lock on whether more powers can be passed. Does Brussels need reform? Yes. Do these institutions need opening up? Yes. Can it be frustrating sometimes? Of course it can. But the question we've got to ask ourselves in this referendum is not, do I like the European Parliament? Frankly, I don't like it very much. The question we've got to ask ourselves, are we better off? Are we stronger? Are we safer if we stay in this organisation or if we leave? That's the question on the ballot paper. And I hope people, I'm sure, will share many of my frustrations about the European Union, but frustrations with an institution, or indeed with a relationship, are often not a justification for walking away. They're an argument for staying and fighting for what you need, for jobs, for investment, for security for our country.
Joseph, thank you very much indeed for that question. We're going to press on a question on law and order from Peter Thompson.
Mr Cameron, just today we have seen yet more evidence of the type of crimes committed by EU nationals who have records in their home country and come here to commit more crimes. If we remain in the EU, how can we protect the public from the EU nationals who have committed offences in our home countries?
Peter, very good question. I can answer it very specifically. First of all, we will keep our border controls. We can stop anyone at our border, EU nationals included, and if we think they're a risk to our country, we don't have to let them in. And in my renegotiation, I strengthened that to give us more freedom to do that. First point. Second point, we've got a lot of European and other foreign nationals in our prisons. And one of my greatest frustrations as Prime Minister is going around to some of these countries, whether it's going to Nigeria or Jamaica or Pakistan, and trying to get foreign nationals out of our prisons and over to the countries where they came from. In Europe, we do at least have a directive on prisoner transfers, which is now coming into force, and we'll be able to get those people out of our prisons so they can be paid for by the governments whose citizens they are. Now, if we leave, we'll be back to the situation that we had before, far, far more difficult to get these people out of our country. Please come back.
The 50 names and individuals that were released today in the press, you, the government, tried to get them out of the country because they've committed serious offences, but Brussels said no, they have to remain.
But that's because...
So how can we deal with that issue? Because
of this prisoner transfer agreement is not yet fully in force.
So when will that be?
It is coming in the coming months. So we're going to see we've already seen some go, and we're going to see a lot more go. But the certainty is this: if we leave and we're outside these directives, we'll be back to the situation we have with other countries on the other side of the world, where it can take months, it can take years, it can sometimes take decades. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, I expect some of us are old enough to remember, when inside Europe, people could flee Britain and go to the Costa del Crime in Spain, and it would take us decades to get them back. Just one more point, I promise I'll come back to you. Because of the European arrest warrant, we can now get people back. 1,100 murderers, rapists and criminals have been brought back to Britain and face justice in our courts because of that. And we lose it if we go.
Why are they entering the UK in the first place? I understand the European arrest warrant, and that's great, taken back to their own country to face justice. But why are they entering the UK in the first place?
Well, they shouldn't, and that's why we keep our borders, and my renegotiation means that we have more freedom to stop people coming in the first place. Leave, and those things go.
OK, thank you both, Peter and Mr Cameron, for the response to that. And we will leave another question with Mr David Greenwood, who's with us again.
Thank you. Mr Cameron, win or lose this referendum, are you finished as Prime Minister? And...
Oh, I thought it was a pretty frank one already.
And if you do lose, what does Britain look like in 20 years' time?
Right. First of all, this is a vote of the British people. Your votes all count equally. It's not a vote for the politicians. And what I've said, having promised this referendum, having arranged this referendum, I've said I would accept your instructions. And I think it's very important that people's individual careers and future don't get caught up in this vote. I want everyone to focus very clearly on the choice. And the choice you've heard tonight. Do you go with Nigel Farage and the Leave team? You put jobs at risk, you potentially shrink our economy? Or do you go with this extraordinary alliance of Greens and Liberals and the Labour Party, a Conservative government, the trade unions, business large and small, and put our differences aside and stay in this organisation for the good of our country? That's the choice. And that's not about my future, that's about the country's future. As for what I think this organisation will look like, did you mean if we stay or if we leave? Which one?
If you lose the argument and we leave the EU, what will Britain look like in 20 years' time?
Just 10 seconds answer, please. Mr.
I worry if we leave that we're going to see our economy suffer because we're going to lose access to the absolutely vital market that we have. And I would say the right thing to do, the British thing to do, is to fight for a great Britain inside a European Union and don't take the Nigel Farage Little England option. That's not the country we want, it's not the country we want for our children, and I don't think it's right for our country. So I hope we vote to remain on June the 23rd.
Cameron, thank you very much indeed. And there we must leave it. Thank you very much indeed, David Cameron. Well, we have heard from David Cameron and from Nigel Farage, both putting forward their arguments, but the decision, of course, will ultimately be yours when the polls open on June the 23rd.
I've been getting away with it all.